They laughed when a poor blacksmith stepped into the Millionaire's arena, until the wild horse everyone feared bowed its head to his whisper. Snow fell quiet over Jackson Hole that morning. No one knew the man's name, or why he dared face the beast that broke every rider. But before the day ended, the silence would say everything. Snow drifted across the small arena on the outskirts of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The cold morning light turned every breath into smoke, and the sound of boots crunching on the frost was swallowed by laughter. On the raised platform, Richard Harlow, the millionaire ranch owner, stood tall with a silver-tipped cane and a voice that cut through the air. $10,000, he declared, for anyone who can last more than 1 minute on my horse. The crowd stirred. Cowboys, ranch hands, townsfolk wrapped in scarves. Some laughed nervously. Others grinned with cruel anticipation. Inside the pen stood Obsidian, a massive black stallion whose muscles rippled beneath a coat like polished stone. His breath rose in clouds, his eyes restless and dark. The horse had thrown every man who dared mount him, and yet through the laughter and taunts, one man walked forward. Caleb Ward. He wasn't a champion rider or a man of prestige. He was a blacksmith, shoulders broad from hammering steel, face burned by years beside the forge, hands scarred and cracked like the land itself. His coat was worn, his boots scuffed, and when he stepped toward the arena gate, the laughter grew louder. Someone shouted, "Hey, Ward, you plan to shoe the horse or ride it?" The laughter exploded again. Caleb didn't answer. His eyes, pale and quiet, didn't look at the people mocking him. They were fixed on the stallion. For a moment, his face softened, as though he saw something familiar in that wild creature pacing behind the fence. Tommy, the ranch hand barely 15, tugged at Caleb's sleeve. "Mr. Ward, you don't have to do this. No one ever lasted longer than 10 seconds. Caleb smiled faintly. "Maybe it's not about lasting." The crowd roared again as Harlow struck the ground with his cane. "Well, look who we have here, the blacksmith. Tell me, Ward, you think the beast will pity your poor hands?" Caleb didn't reply. He removed his gloves, tucking them into his belt. The air bit his skin, but he didn't flinch. He simply rested one hand on the cold wood of the gate and looked at Obsidian, whose ears flicked toward him with a snort. The stallion pawed at the ground, nostrils flaring. The sound echoed like thunder under the frozen sky. The crowd hushed for a breath, sensing something shift, not in the horse, but in the man. There was no arrogance in Caleb's stance, no challenge, only a quiet, heavy calm. The gate creaked open slightly. A gust of wind swept through, carrying bits of snow like scattered ash. Harlow leaned on his cane, smiling with smug satisfaction. "Let's see if the blacksmith knows more about horses than fire." Caleb stepped forward, one measured step after another, until he was only a few yards from the pen. The horse lifted its head high, muscles tightening like drawn wire. Their eyes met. For the first time, the laughter behind him faltered. Caleb's voice was low, almost lost to the wind. "Easy, boy." Obsidian's tail flicked. The sound of the crowd dissolved, replaced by the pulse of breath, by the creak of leather, by the eerie quiet that settles before something inevitable. Harlow tilted his head. "What's the matter, Ward? Cat got your courage?" Caleb didn't move, didn't blink. The snow fell thicker now, swirling around them like ghosts. "I'm not here to prove anything," he murmured. The crowd didn't hear him, but the horse did. Obsidian froze mid-step, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. Then came a deep, guttural snort, not of rage but of warning. Caleb smiled faintly, his breath clouding in the cold. "I know," he whispered. "You've seen enough of men like him." The stallion's ears flattened, his hooves scraped the frozen dirt. Harlow tapped his cane impatiently, scoffing. "You'll be kissing the ground before the minute's up." Caleb's gaze never left the horse. "If that happens," he said softly, "at least I'll have looked him in the eye." He took another step closer. The horse shifted its weight, muscles tensing. The crowd held its breath. For a second, even the wind paused, as if the land itself wanted to see what would happen next. And when Caleb finally laid his hand on the cold wooden rail, something in the air changed. Subtle, but real. The laughter didn't come back. It had frozen there, with the snow. And the silence that followed was the kind that warned everyone watching. This was not going to end the way they expected. That night, the forge was quiet. The fire that usually sang beneath Caleb Ward's hammer had burned down to embers, casting a soft red glow over iron tools and horseshoes half-shaped on the anvil. Outside, the wind howled against the wooden walls, carrying the faint whistle of the Wyoming plains. Caleb sat alone on a wooden stool, sleeves rolled up, his hands blackened with soot. He held a piece of charred leather between his fingers, what remained of Maple's bridle. The smell of ash still clung to it after all these years. Maple had been his first horse, his partner, the only living thing that seemed to understand him after his wife's passing. The fire that killed Maple had burned through more than the stables. It had hollowed out a part of him. He looked toward the small window, where snow danced under the lamplight. Tomorrow, the whole town would gather again, not to cheer him, but to laugh. And yet, for the first time in years, the thought of facing that laughter didn't scare him. What frightened him more was the sound of silence after it, the kind that followed when the world decided you were no longer worth watching. Tommy appeared at the doorway, hat in his hands. "You're really going through with it, Mr. Ward?" His voice cracked a little. The boy's cheeks were red from the cold. Caleb smiled faintly without looking up. "A man has to face the things that burned him, Tommy. Otherwise, he just becomes the ashes." Tommy hesitated. "That horse isn't like Maple. It's mean. It doesn't trust nobody." Caleb turned his gaze toward the forge fire, eyes reflecting the red glow. "Neither did I, once." The boy shuffled closer. "People are saying Mr. Harlow's gonna raise the bet if you try. He thinks it'll be good entertainment." "Entertainment," Caleb echoed softly, almost to himself. "That's what people call fear when they're not the ones feeling it." He stood and walked to the open doorway. The cold slapped his face, sharp and cleansing. In the distance, the arena lights glowed faintly against the snowy night. Somewhere beyond that, Obsidian was locked in his pen, a creature of strength and fury, caged for sport. Caleb closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat, he could almost hear the horse's breath through the wind. His mind wandered to his wife, Grace, her laughter in the old barn, the smell of hay and warm bread. The night Maple died, Grace's photograph had fallen from the shelf and cracked across the glass. He had never fixed it. Some things, he believed, were meant to stay broken. But standing in that doorway now, the cold cutting through his skin, Caleb realized something. He wasn't trying to prove himself to anyone, not Harlow, not the town, not even the horse. He was trying to forgive himself for surviving when everything else didn't. Tommy broke the silence. "Why you, Mr. Ward?" Caleb's voice was quiet, steady. "Because no one else is listening." He stepped back inside, fed the fire another piece of wood, and the flames rose again, licking the air like a memory trying to come back to life. Later, as the wind softened, he lay on the cot beside the forge. The room smelled of smoke and iron. His eyes closed, but his mind didn't rest. He saw Maple's eyes, wide, frightened, trusting him until the roof caved in. Then he saw Obsidian's, dark, wild, the same fear trapped inside. He whispered into the dark, words no one could hear. "I couldn't save her. Maybe I can save him." And for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't dream of fire. He dreamed of snow, cold, silent, and full of second chances. When the dawn came, he was already awake. The forge fire had died, but the coals were still warm. He put on his coat, picked up the same pair of gloves he had left on the fence yesterday, and slipped them into his pocket. He wouldn't need them today. Outside, the sun rose pale and slow over the mountains. The air bit hard, clean, and alive. Caleb tightened his scarf and began walking toward the arena, each step heavy but certain they could. Wind carried whispers from the town. Talk of the blacksmith, the madman, the fool. But he didn't listen. Ahead of him, beyond the frost and laughter, waited the horse that would either break him or set him free. And somewhere deep down, he already knew. The difference between the two didn't matter anymore. The arena was alive with tension long before Caleb Ward arrived. Frost clung to the wooden rails, and the echo of boots against the frozen earth rolled like a heartbeat beneath the grandstands. The crowd, bundled in heavy coats and hats, stamped their feet for warmth, or perhaps impatience. They hadn't come for a contest. They'd come for a spectacle. Obsidian stood in the center pen, taller than most men, his black coat gleaming under the pale light. Steam rose from his nostrils with each breath, curling into the frigid air like smoke from a furnace. His ears flicked in every direction, searching for threats that weren't there. His muscles rippled, not with pride, but with restraint. Even from a distance, Caleb could see it. The horse was beautiful, in the way a storm is beautiful, something that doesn't want to be looked at for too long. Harlow, dressed in a long fur coat, leaned against the railing, silver cane gleaming in his hand. "Back again, Ward?" His smile was thin, sharp, the kind that left no warmth behind. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." Caleb ignored the taunt. He moved slowly, every step deliberate. Like a man entering a church, he could feel hundreds of eyes following him, measuring, judging. Some faces held curiosity, others pity, but most wore that same smirk Harlow had perfected. A smirk that said, "We already know how this ends." He stopped just a few feet from the gate. The steel latch was cold beneath his palm. On the other side, Obsidian's massive hooves crushed the frozen ground. Their eyes met. And for a fleeting instant, the noise of the crowd disappeared. Caleb had seen that look before, not in animals, but in people who had been hurt too long and too often. It wasn't rage that burned there. It was memory. "Careful, blacksmith," someone shouted. "That thing doesn't like kindness." Caleb didn't look back. "Neither do most men," he murmured. Harlow's voice cut through the silence. "Let's make it interesting. 2 minutes, double the bet. That is, if you still think you can stay alive that long. The crowd roared with laughter. Caleb kept his eyes on the stallion. "It's not about the bet," he said quietly. "What's that?" Harlow barked. Caleb finally looked up at him, and his voice carried farther than expected. "You think this is about money, Mr. Harlow, but it's about what you broke." The laughter faltered. For a moment, even the wind seemed to still. Harlow's grin thinned. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Caleb nodded toward the horse. "You didn't beat the wild out of him. You beat the trust." Few murmurs rippled through the crowd. The millionaire's jaw tightened, but he forced another grin. "Fine words for a man about to eat dirt." Obsidian snorted loudly, slamming one hoof into the ground. The sound cracked like thunder. Caleb didn't flinch. He unlatched the gate slowly and stepped through. The wooden hinges creaked, echoing like a door closing on the world behind him. The horse shifted, eyes wide, ears pinned back. Caleb didn't rush him. He just stood still, his breath visible in the air between them. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "You remember this smell, don't you?" The crowd leaned forward, trying to hear. Caleb's coat carried the scent of iron and ash, the same smell that lived in every stable, every forge, every place where man tried to shape what nature had already perfected. Obsidian's head turned slightly, uncertain. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. Not a rope, not a whip, just a broken horseshoe, blackened with age. The crowd thought it was foolishness, but the horse's gaze dropped to it and stayed there. "This is what I do," Caleb said softly. "I fix what's bent, not what's wild." A low rumble passed through the stands, uneasy murmurs of confusion. But inside the pen, something else stirred. The horse's front hoof pawed the snow again, slower this time. The distance between them was still wide, yet it felt like the air had thinned. Tommy, standing by the fence, whispered, "He's not fighting him." Caleb took a slow breath, lowering the horseshoe to the ground. "You don't have to trust me," he whispered. "Just don't run." The stallion's nostrils flared. The sound was deep and alive, the kind that fills space like thunder before rain. Then, to everyone's disbelief, Obsidian's massive frame stilled. For a moment, man and beast breathed in rhythm, two survivors measuring the weight of each other's pain. Harlow's voice sliced through the air. "Enough of this nonsense. Get on with it or get out." Caleb didn't move. His tone remained calm, almost reverent. "You can't force something into calm, sir. You can only invite it." The millionaire slammed his cane against the rail, the sharp crack jolting Obsidian's head high again. The horse jerked backward, teeth bared, tail slashing the air. The crowd gasped. Caleb took a step forward, not retreating but grounding himself, hands open, voice low and even. "Easy," he said. I know. For a few tense seconds, it was chaos contained. The horse shaking, the crowd murmuring, Harlow sneering. Then, almost imperceptibly, the storm broke. The stallion's shoulders dropped. He exhaled. Caleb took that breath too, matching it. And for the first time that day, the arena fell completely silent. Snow drifted through the open gate, landing on Caleb's shoulders. The sun was faint behind the clouds, casting everything in shades of gray. To the crowd, it was a strange sight. A man and a horse standing still in the middle of a frozen pen. But to Caleb, It was the first honest conversation either of them had had in years. He whispered, "We're not so different, are we?" Obsidian blinked, head lowering just slightly. Not surrender, but recognition. Behind the rail, Harlow's smirk was gone. Caleb didn't smile. He only breathed, steady and quiet, as the cold air filled his lungs and the world began to fade into that sacred stillness before change. Whatever came next, whether triumph or ruin, he knew this moment mattered more. Because in the eyes of the wild beast before him, he had finally seen himself. The clouds rolled in low that morning, pressing the light flat against the frozen ground. The air hung still, heavy with a silence that made every sound, a boot scraping the dirt, a breath drawn through a scarf, echo like thunder. The crowd had grown larger. News had spread through town that Caleb Ward, the blacksmith with nothing to lose, had dared to step into the pen with Obsidian, and though most had come expecting a fall, they couldn't look away. Caleb stood inside the ring again. He'd slept little the night before. The smell of iron and smoke still clung to his coat. Obsidian was restless, shifting from hoof to hoof, the frost cracking beneath him. His breath came in thick bursts, steaming in the cold. His mane clung to his neck, damp with sweat. The stallion was magnificent, but his eyes still carried the sharp, frantic edge of a creature waiting to be hurt. Harlow leaned on the rail, his silver cane glinting under the gray sky. "You had your little moment yesterday," he said, voice oily with amusement. "But a trick of luck isn't the same as mastery. Let's see if the blacksmith can repeat his miracle." Caleb didn't answer. His silence only seemed to irritate the man more. He took a step closer to the center of the pen, his boots leaving faint prints in the snow. The air was thin, each breath burning cold through his throat. For a moment he simply looked at the horse, studying the rhythm of its breathing, the twitch of its muscles, the flick of its ears. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee. A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one understood what he was doing. Not even Tommy, who gripped the railing tight. "Why's he kneeling?" someone whispered. Caleb slipped off his gloves and set them beside him. The skin of his hands was raw, calloused, stained black with soot from the forge. He pressed one palm against the snow. The chill bit deep into his bones, sharp and clean. The white surface began to darken beneath the warmth of his touch. "It's not dominance you want," he murmured, voice barely audible over the wind. "It's space." Obsidian snorted, the sound sharp enough to slice the silence. His head tossed once, twice, testing the distance. But Caleb didn't move. He stayed, kneeling, steady as stone, breathing slow. He wanted the horse to see everything about him. The scars, the stillness, the humility. The stallion pawed at the ground, muscles tightening along his neck. For a second, the crowd tensed, expecting an explosion. But instead, Obsidian hesitated. His massive head dipped slightly, eyes narrowing, ears shifting forward. He was curious. Caleb's voice came again, steady, measured. "You don't owe them anything." The world shrank to the space between man and horse. Every sound, every cough, every shuffle from the bleachers faded until only two heartbeats seemed to exist. Caleb didn't look up. He didn't demand trust. He simply offered it, Then it happened. A small, quiet miracle that no one saw coming. Obsidian stepped forward, just one step. Snow crunched beneath his hoof, the sound soft but sharp enough to carry through the entire arena. The horse's breath came fast, his chest rising and falling. Then another step, closer. The air thickened, trembling on the edge of disbelief. Caleb whispered, "That's it." He didn't lift his hand from the snow. Instead, he turned it slightly, palm up, offering nothing but stillness. The horse's nostrils flared. A puff of warm air brushed across his fingers. For a fleeting second, the world held its breath. And then, contact. The tip of Obsidian's muzzle touched his hand, gentle as a sigh. The crowd gasped. Harlow's cane froze mid-tap. Tommy's eyes widened in awe. Caleb didn't move. He kept his hand steady, the warmth of the animal's breath spreading across his skin like a pulse. "See?" he said softly. "No fire, no whip, just time." The stallion's head lowered further, his ears flicking forward, a gesture of cautious peace. A shiver ran through his body, not from fear, but from the release of it. Caleb let his other hand rise slowly, touching the horse's neck. The coat was warm, trembling under his fingertips. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Snow fell around them in slow motion, melting on the horse's back, on the man's hair. It was the kind of silence that lives only in places where trust is born. From the stands, a man whispered, "He's talking to it." "No," someone else replied quietly. "He's listening." Harlow's jaw tightened. "Enough of this," he muttered, his voice breaking the spell. He slammed his cane on the rail. The sharp crack split the air. Obsidian jerked his head up, muscles coiling again in fear. Caleb rose to his feet slowly, never breaking eye contact. "Easy," he whispered, stepping closer instead of back. His breath came steady, his presence calm, unshaken by the disruption. The horse's panic faltered. It blinked, snorted, and, astonishingly, stilled again. The tension shattered. The crowd didn't cheer. They couldn't. They only watched, silent, as a man and a beast stood face to face, the snow between them marked by one handprint and one hoofprint, side by side. Caleb looked at Harlow, his voice calm but cutting. "You can't own what you never earned." Harlow said nothing. His face had gone pale. The crowd, still wordless, could only watch as Caleb turned away from them, his hand brushing the stallion's neck once more before stepping back toward the gate. Obsidian didn't move to attack. He didn't retreat either. He simply stood there, breathing slow, eyes following the blacksmith as if something inside him had shifted. And in that frozen stillness, the people of Jackson Hole understood something they hadn't before. That sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is kneel. The morning after the snow had fallen heavier. The arena lay blanketed in white, untouched except for the faint imprint of a hand and hoof, still frozen into the ground from the day before. A quiet memory left behind by two living souls who had simply chosen not to fight. When Caleb Ward returned, the crowd was smaller. The spectacle had become something different now. Not entertainment, but curiosity. People spoke more softly. Even the cold seemed to hold its breath. Harlow was already there, coat collar high, cane tapping the rail in a rhythm of impatience. "I thought you might crawl back to your forge," he said, smirking, "but I see pride can be a cruel leash." Caleb didn't respond. He carried no saddle, no rope, no tool. just his bare hands, and that same stillness the town had come to both mock and fear. He walked straight toward the stallion, whose ears twitched at the sound of his boots. Obsidian was calmer today, but not tame. His eyes still sharp, restless. His breath rose in plumes that glimmered against the gray sky. The horse pawed once, twice, then stood motionless, watching Caleb with that deep, unknowable awareness animals possess, the kind that senses honesty long before it believes it. Caleb stopped within a few feet, voice low, steady as a heartbeat. "You remember yesterday, don't you?" His breath fogged the air. "You came closer than you thought you could." The horse shifted his weight, the muscles along his neck rippling. He remembered. Caleb took off his gloves again and spoke barely above a whisper. His words carried more by tone than sound. "You've been hit, shouted at, feared. You don't owe them fear anymore." For a long while, there was nothing but the sigh of wind over the rails. Then Obsidian's head dipped slightly, the movement cautious, as if testing the memory of kindness. Caleb extended one hand, slow and deliberate. The horse didn't retreat. Instead, he exhaled, a long, trembling breath that misted between them. Caleb stepped closer, resting his palm just below the horse's jaw. The stallion's skin quivered beneath his touch. "That's it," he murmured. "You're not alone." The crowd was silent, transfixed. Even Harlow had stopped tapping his cane. What happened next wasn't loud or showy, was fragile, like the sound of a single string being plucked in a quiet room. Caleb leaned forward, his forehead almost touching the horse's. His lips moved, but no one heard what he said. It wasn't language, it was something smaller, softer, a sound between apology and forgiveness. And somehow, the stallion understood. Obsidian's ears flicked forward. He gave a small, almost human sigh, his eyes closing for a second. The tension in his body loosened. Caleb kept whispering. Not words, just a rhythm. The same kind of rhythm he used when hammering steel into shape. One heartbeat at a time. One note of patience after another. It wasn't taming. It was listening. Tommy, standing near the fence, could barely breathe. He's talking to it," he whispered. A woman beside him nodded slowly, tears shining in her eyes. "No," she said. "He's forgiving it." Harlow scowled. "Ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He stepped closer to the fence. "This isn't magic. It's a trick." Caleb finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto Harlow's. "No trick," he said calmly. "Just respect." Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, the horse took another step toward him, closing the last inch of space between man and beast. Caleb raised one hand to the stallion's cheek, and the horse leaned into it, heavy, trusting. The blacksmith smiled faintly, a fragile thing barely visible through the mist of their breath. He spoke again, voice barely audible. "You can stop fighting now." The stallion's nostrils flared, his breath warm against Caleb's coat. Then he did something no one could have predicted. He lowered his head until it brushed the man's chest and stayed there. The arena went completely still. No sound of wind, no cough, no shifting boots. It was the silence of revelation, the kind that doesn't ask to be explained. Harlow's hand trembled around his cane. He stared at the sight before him. The beast that had defied every rider, standing peacefully against the chest of a man who had brought nothing but patience. Caleb gently ran his fingers along the stallion's mane, his voice a faint murmur. "That's it. Breathe. Nobody's here to take anything from you." The horse's breathing slowed, his body softening. The muscles that had once been iron under the skin now moved like waves. Fluid. Alive. Unafraid. When Caleb finally stepped back, Obsidian didn't rear or lash out. He followed him, one step, then another, until they both stood side by side at the center of the arena. The crowd didn't applaud. They didn't know how. What they had witnessed didn't fit into the language of victory or defeat. It was something else. Something smaller, quieter, and infinitely greater. Caleb looked toward the boy at the fence. "See, Tommy? Sometimes what's wild isn't meant to be broken. It's meant to be heard." Tommy swallowed hard. "What did you say to him, Mr. Ward?" Caleb smiled faintly, the wind tugging at his coat. "Nothing he didn't already know." Behind them, Harlow's cane struck the ground again, once, hard, like thunder cracking over the mountains. But it no longer commanded attention. The sound fell flat, meaningless against the quiet strength now holding the space between man and horse. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their voices hushed, their laughter gone. The only sound that lingered was the faint, rhythmic breathing of two survivors, one human, one not, standing in the snow, healing in the only language that needed no words. The sky above Jackson Hole was the color of pewter, cold, heavy, and waiting. The snow that had fallen overnight had been trampled flat inside the arena, turning the ground into a pale mirror. The grandstands were quieter now, filled with people who spoke in whispers, as if afraid that raising their voices might break whatever fragile miracle they'd seen the day before. Caleb Ward stepped into the pen without announcement or ceremony, his boots pressed softly into the snow, leaving shallow prints behind. He carried no rope, no bit, no saddle, only the steady rhythm of his breath. Across the ring, Obsidian lifted his head, his black coat dusted with frost, his mane tangled but glistening in the dull morning light. The horse's ears twitched when he saw the man, as if recognizing him. Harlow was already there, standing behind the fence, cane in hand, his smile thin and tight. "You really think you can ride him, blacksmith?" he called out. His tone was calm, but there was something brittle beneath it, a faint crack in his confidence. Caleb didn't answer. He simply reached out one hand, palm open, and waited. Obsidian took a few slow steps forward, his breath steaming through the cold. The world seemed to shrink again to just the two of them. One man, one creature, bound by something neither could explain. The stallion stopped inches away. Caleb's hand met warm skin. He could feel the horse's heartbeat beneath his palm, deep and steady. For a long moment, they just breathed together. The wind softened. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried over the valley. Then, with a movement so careful it was almost reverent, Caleb placed his foot in the stirrup and pulled himself up onto the horse's back. The sound that followed wasn't a cheer. It was a collective gasp, a single breath drawn by every soul watching. Obsidian tensed beneath him, muscles coiling. The blacksmith didn't squeeze his legs or pull the reins. He didn't command. He just waited, hands resting lightly, letting the horse feel his weight, his stillness. "Easy," he whispered. "I'm not here to win. I'm just here." For a few heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the horse began to move. One step, Then another. The sound of hooves on snow echoed through the arena, soft, rhythmic, hypnotic. It wasn't the violent dance the crowd had seen before. It was slow, deliberate, almost graceful. Obsidian walked in a circle, his head lowered slightly, his movements careful, but willing. Caleb's posture was calm, upright, balanced. He looked like a man listening to music only he could hear. His breath matched the rhythm of the steps, in, out, steady as a forge fire that never dies. The crowd remained silent, too afraid to break the spell. Even Harlow's face had gone pale, the smugness drained away. He had spent years turning the horse's defiance into entertainment, and now he was watching that same defiance melt into trust, not through strength, but through gentleness. Obsidian's pace quickened. Snow rose in small clouds beneath his hooves. His tail flicked once, his ears flicking back and forth as if uncertain whether to trust this new rhythm. Caleb leaned slightly forward, his hand brushing the horse's neck. "That's it," he murmured. "You're all right." The stallion snorted, shaking his head, and for a moment the tension returned, that old wildness, that sharp memory of pain. Caleb didn't pull away. He steadied his breathing, whispering again, softer this time, like a prayer. "You're not what they made you to be." Something in the horse's body shifted, a tremor that passed like a wave through his shoulders. Then the energy broke, not in an explosion, but in surrender. Obsidian lowered his head and moved freely, each step smoother than the last. The arena remained hushed. Even the wind seemed to stop at the fence, unwilling to disturb what it was seeing. Caleb guided the horse gently into a wider circle, then a trot. Smooth, balanced, quiet. There was no dust, no roar, no spectacle. Just the steady rhythm of hooves against snow, the sound of peace returning to a creature that had only ever known fear. Tommy stood near the gate, eyes wide, breath visible in the cold. He's really doing it," the boy whispered. "No," an old rancher beside him said softly. "They're doing it together." The horse picked up speed now, his muscles stretching, his steps strong and certain. Caleb's hands moved slightly, barely touching the reins, guiding without forcing. They moved in harmony, a single silhouette cutting through the gray light, a living testament to patience. When the horse finally slowed, steam rose from his body like smoke from a smoldering fire. Caleb leaned forward, pressing his palm gently against the stallion's neck. "Good boy," he said quietly. "You found it, didn't you?" The quiet place. Obsidian let out a long, low breath. The sound was soft, but it carried across the arena like a confession. The moment lingered. Fragile, timeless. Then Caleb slid down, landing lightly on the snow. He didn't lift his hands in victory. He simply stood there, facing the horse. Obsidian stepped closer, brushing his nose against Caleb's shoulder, a gesture of trust so pure it made a few in the crowd wipe their eyes. No one spoke. The stillness was deeper than silence, the kind that feels like prayer. Harlow's cane slipped slightly in his grip. He whispered, almost to himself, "Impossible." Caleb turned his head toward him. His voice was calm, certain. Not impossible. Just never tried with kindness. Harlow said nothing more. Snow began to fall again, flakes drifting between them. Caleb reached out one last time, his hand resting on the horse's cheek. You did good, he murmured. Obsidian blinked slowly, exhaling into the man's hand. There was no applause, no roar of approval. The crowd didn't need one. What they had witnessed couldn't be celebrated. It could only be felt. And as Caleb walked the horse toward the gate, the quiet between them spoke louder than any victory ever could. By the time the sun began to slide toward the ridge, the snow in the arena had turned the color of dull silver. The cold light cut through the wooden slats of the stands, falling across the faces of the onlookers who still hadn't found the will to leave. No one had expected what they had seen that morning. No spectacle of chaos, no roaring beast, no humiliation to laugh at. Just a man and a horse who had walked together in silence. Richard Harlow stood alone near the rail now, his cane planted in the ground, the metal tip pressed into the frozen dirt. He watched Caleb and Obsidian circle slowly, their movements synchronized, effortless. It wasn't a performance. It was communication. Quiet, wordless, pure. And that truth sat heavy in Harlow's chest, heavier than the weight of all his money and pride. "Do you see it now?" one of the ranchers muttered near him. "That's what a real horse whisperer looks like." Harlow's jaw tightened. "Nonsense," he said, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the tremor beneath. He had built his reputation on breaking things, horses, men, reputations. But watching the blacksmith, something in him began to unravel, like thread pulled loose from an old coat. Caleb brought the stallion to a halt at the center of the arena. The horse lowered his head, steam rising from his body like a veil. The two stood there, still, steady, as if carved from the same breath of winter. The audience, mesmerized, waited for Caleb to claim victory, but he didn't. He dismounted slowly, one hand sliding down the horse's neck before his boots touched the snow. Harlow couldn't stay silent any longer. "You think you've proven something?" he called out. Caleb turned, his face calm, unguarded. "Not proven," he said softly. "Just remembered." Remembered what? That not everything wild needs to be broken to belong. The murmur that swept through the crowd was different now. Not laughter, not disbelief, but something hushed, uncertain. Harlow's cane struck the ground once. "You got lucky, Ward. Don't mistake chance for talent." Caleb smiled, faintly. "Luck doesn't breathe. It listens." The words struck deeper than any insult could. The millionaire's composure faltered. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting to see what the man who owned everything would do when faced with someone who wanted nothing. Obsidian flicked his tail, ears twitching as if picking up the tension. Caleb placed a hand on the horse's shoulder, murmuring something only the animal could hear. The stallion's head turned slightly toward Harlow, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. For a moment, the old man saw himself reflected there, small, rigid, afraid. The wind began to pick up, brushing through the stands, carrying a faint howl through the valley. Caleb stepped closer to the fence, his breath misting in the cold. "You used him," he said, voice low but clear. "You turned his pain into your pride." Harlow gripped his cane tighter. "He's a horse. He's made to obey." Caleb's gaze softened, almost pitying. "No, he's made to trust. You just never gave him a reason to." The words lingered in the air, heavy as snowfall. For a long time, Harlow said nothing. The cold stung his face, and somewhere deep inside, He felt that same sting crawl inward. His cane trembled slightly in his hand. He tried to speak, but his voice came out hoarse. "You don't understand, Ward. You think kindness wins in the end? You'll see. It doesn't." Caleb looked at him for a long time before answering. "Maybe not. But it doesn't lose either." Obsidian shifted beside him, pressing his muzzle gently against Caleb's shoulder. The gesture silenced even the most skeptical eyes in the crowd. The man and the beast, two survivors who had refused to bow to cruelty, stood side by side like equals. The millionaire turned away, trying to hide the tremor that reached his throat. The laughter that once filled this arena had turned on him now. Not from the people, but from the memory of his own arrogance echoing back. For the first time, he understood what silence felt like when it wasn't peaceful, when it was filled with shame. Caleb didn't look back at him. He reached up and ran his hand along the stallion's neck. "Let's go, boy," he whispered. "We've done enough here." He led Obsidian toward the open gate. The horse followed easily, no rope between them, no bit, no command, just quiet trust. As they passed the crowd, people stepped aside, hats in hand. Not out of reverence, but respect. The kind of respect that isn't demanded, only earned. Behind them, Harlow stood still, the wind tugging at his coat. His cane slipped from his grip, falling into the snow with a soft, muted sound. He didn't pick it up. Tommy approached him carefully, the boy's voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Harlow, do you think he tamed the horse?" The old man's eyes stayed on the gate where the pair had disappeared. His lips moved, but his voice cracked on the words. "No," he said quietly. "He tamed me." The boy didn't understand, not yet, but the crowd did. Because in that moment, the truth was undeniable. Pride had fallen, and what replaced it was something far rarer. Humility born from awe. The wind howled again through the open space of the arena, sweeping across the tracks they had left behind. Caleb's footprints and the stallion's hoofprints faded together under the snow until you couldn't tell which belonged to whom. It was as if the land itself wanted to remember them, not as two beings, but as one. Evening crept slowly across Jackson Hole, the light fading into a hush of blue and gold. The wind had softened, carrying only the faint creak of wood and the distant call of crows heading home over the frozen fields. The arena stood nearly empty now, its bleachers coated in a thin layer of frost. Only footprints and hoofprints remained, overlapping in a winding trail that led toward the open gate and out into the valley beyond. Caleb Ward walked beside Obsidian, his steps unhurried. The stallion's great head hung low, each breath a puff of white that melted into the cold air. Behind them, Tommy followed quietly, his boots crunching the snow. He didn't speak, afraid that any word might shatter the stillness that hung like glass between sky and earth. At the edge of the field, Caleb stopped. He turned toward the mountains, the last line of sunlight tracing their peaks like fire on ice. Obsidian stood beside him, still and calm, his dark coat shimmering beneath the fading light. "You're free now," Caleb said softly, running a hand along the horse's neck. "You don't belong to anyone. Not him, not me." Obsidian flicked an ear, his eyes deep and quiet. The man smiled faintly, that tired, peaceful kind of smile that comes only after a long fight has finally ended. Behind them, the sound of footsteps approached. Richard Harlow. He was different now, no longer towering with confidence, no longer wrapped in the armor of pride. His fur coat hung open, his cane dragging behind him as if it had lost its purpose. The crowd had left him there, alone in the stands, long enough to feel the echo of his own silence. "Ward," he said quietly. "Wait." Caleb turned, his expression unreadable. The wind played with his hair, carrying bits of snow through the fading light. Harlow hesitated, then looked at the horse. "You made a fool of me today." His voice trembled, the words too fragile to sound cruel. "But I suppose I deserved it." Caleb shook his head. "No one deserves to lose themselves, Mr. Harlow. But it happens when you stop listening." The older man swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "You think I can undo what I've done?" Caleb looked back at the stallion. "No one can undo anything, but you can stop making the same noise." For a moment, the two men stood there, not enemies, not rivals, just two people facing the weight of their choices under the same dying sky. Harlow lowered his cane into the snow and exhaled. "He doesn't look afraid anymore." "He isn't," Caleb said. "Fear's what you feed when you don't give trust. You taught him to fight. I just reminded him how to breathe." The millionaire looked down at the ground. "And what about you?" Caleb smiled gently. "I remembered how to forgive." Obsidian nudged his shoulder as if agreeing. The man chuckled softly and patted the horse's cheek. "You did good, boy." Tommy finally spoke, his voice small against the vastness of the plains. "Mr. Ward, are you going to keep him?" Caleb shook his head slowly. "No, he's not mine to keep." The boy frowned. "But he trusts you. That's why I can let him go." He stepped aside, giving the stallion space. Obsidian stood still for a moment, then turned his head toward the open land stretching beyond the fence. Endless snow, open sky, the faint line of a stream glinting like silver. The world beyond was wild and untamed, but it was honest. Caleb whispered one last time. "Go on?" The horse hesitated, then began to walk. One step, two, then a trot. His black mane caught the last glow of the sunset, turning gold at the edges as he broke into a steady run. Snow burst beneath his hooves, scattering like sparks from a forge. Harlow watched, eyes wide, until the dark shape of the horse disappeared over the ridge. There was no sound, but the soft sigh of wind filling the space he left behind. Caleb watched too, his hand still raised in farewell. "He'll remember," he said quietly. Harlow nodded, though his voice was barely there. "So will we." The three of them stood in silence for a long time, the blacksmith, the boy, the man who had once owned everything. The mountains glowed faintly under the last trace of sun, and the snow reflected it back like a promise. Then Harlow said, "You changed the story, Ward." Caleb smiled. "No, sir. The story changed itself once we stopped trying to control it." They turned back toward town, their figures growing small against the twilight. The wind rose again, carrying only one lingering sound, the rhythmic echo of hooves far off in the distance, fading into nothing. And in that silence, the people who had watched, those who had mocked, who had doubted, found themselves unable to speak. Because deep down they understood. What they'd seen wasn't a trick or luck or skill. It was redemption, quiet, unpolished, and real. Long after the last light vanished from the horizon, the arena remained still. Only one thing marked what had happened there. A single handprint beside a single hoofprint frozen into the snow. Together. The sound that silenced them all. If this story touched something in you, tell me what part stayed in your heart. I read every comment, and your thoughts keep these stories alive. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There's another story waiting, somewhere in the quiet between man and horse.